Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Greatly appreciate you braving the rain to come out for this conservation conversation. My name is Heidi Helmuth, and I'm the curator of primates here at the zoo. And it is really my honor to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Marc Ancrenat is a wildlife veterinarian, and he's been studying wildlife around the world for about 30 years. He's done work in Madagascar, with a project that did the first radio collaring ever of Ai. He's worked in Central Africa studying chimpanzees, gorillas, and other primates. And for the past 20 years, he's been in Malaysian Borneo studying orangutans and other wildlife and working with the community, which you're going to hear a lot about tonight. I was fortunate to meet Marc about 15 years ago when he gave a presentation at a zoo I worked at. And his parting words to me after we spoke a little bit after his talk were, "You must come to Sabah someday," which is where he works. And I thought, that's not going to happen. I can't see myself going to Borneo. Well, a year and a half ago, I went to Sabah, and I got a chance to see firsthand the wonderful work that Marc and his team are doing. It's amazing with the resources they have, the impact that they're having on the conservation of the animals in this biodiversity hotspot in the world. And the fact that he was able to come here and share some of this with us is fantastic as well. The Wild Care Institute, the St. Lucie Wild Care Institute, has been helping to support Marc's program for about 12 years. And this is the first time he's been able to come and do a presentation here. So we're very honored to have him, and please help me welcome Marc Ancrenat.
Thanks, Eddie. Well, I could invite you to come to Borneo, but the weather is about the same than here. So you don't need to come. It's just raining all the time over there. Except that if you want to see wild orangutan, wild elephant, wild proboscis monkey, yes, please do. So come and see us in Borneo. So before I go to my presentation, I would like to share with you a couple of videos that have been done by our teams who are living there in Borneo. And so the first one is about 6-7 minutes, and it's about an orangutan who is living at our study site. And let's start with it. Are you happy with that? To watch a video? I don't fall asleep, huh? Female is Jenny, and we took this footage 4 years ago when her baby was about 2 days old. As you can see, the baby is small, very light in color. So we followed Jenny for a couple of days at this time. the baby was stillborn and he died because of a cliff pallet after a week. Jenny spent 48 hours with the baby, mourning the baby, and then she left the body in a nest when they retrieved it. And Jenny is a very old female, she's at least 45 years old. And so we were a bit concerned that this would be our last chance to breed. And of course, it was very tough for us and for the team following orangutan in Sabah where I work. But a year later, we are still following Jenny, and this is 3 years ago now. This is what happened. We have called this baby Ocean, and today Ocean is 3 years and 3 months old. She's doing extremely well, and Jenny is taking care of Ocean a lot. So if you come to see us in Borneo, not only you will have the rain like here, but you will have that, unlike here. I have another short video which will not be about orangutan. It's about Good evening. I wanted to share these two videos with you just to immerse you a little bit with what we do, but also because these videos have been done once again by the people from our teams, and they are all from the village. And so it's very great to see this kind of final results, highlighting some of the animals we are working with, highlighting some of the work that we are doing. It's all done by our teams. So as Eddie said, my name is Marc. I'm French. You can hear that. I have been working as a vet in Africa in different countries. I was also working in Saudi Arabia. I was in charge of the Arabian Oryx program for the kingdom for 3 years. I say that because I know that in St. Louis, you have a strong affiliation with North Africa and release of ungulate. So it's really something that is close to my heart as well. And 20 years ago, Isabelle Lachman and myself, we decided to move on and to go to Borneo to create the Kinabatangan Orangutan Conservation Program. So I have been living there for 20 years now, and this program was created by the French NGO Hutan. Hutan is a huge NGO in France. It's me and Isabelle. So together with the Sabah Wildlife Department, the state authorities of Sabah, we decided to create KOCP and to start working there in Borneo. This is a forest, This is a picture of the forest of Borneo. And this is where Borneo is. More or less as far as it is possible to be from St. Louis, Missouri. Seriously. Borneo is a big island. It's the third largest island in the world, and it's about 3 times the size of your state, just to give you an idea. And it's split in 3 different countries. Malaysia, 2 states, Sabah, Sarawak, as you can see in the picture. In between, we have a tiny state called Brunei, and 2/3 of these islands belong to Indonesia, the dark green, and this is Kalimantan. We are working in Sabah, Malaysian part of the island, and it's the northern side of the Borneo Island as well. So this is where we are working. So if you want to come and see us, you go there, north, not south. Okay? I'm sure that for those of you, some of you have been to Borneo or to Southeast Asia, but I'm pretty sure that most of you are familiar with one of the issues that make the news regularly, the haze and the fires, forest fires, pit, swamp fires, and so forth, that have been coined as the worst environmental crime of the century by Borneo Future, another initiative I'm co-leading with Eric Maillard. So every few years, when we have dry weather in Borneo, the forest is burning. And every few years, it costs a lot of money, the costs are very high in terms of human health, financial cost, and also, of course, environmental cost. So this is the kind of things I guess you have heard about Borneo, the bad things. What about the wildlife? This is Tam. Tam is the last Sumatran rhinoceros living in Sabah. It's a male. This subspecies of Sumatran rhino is virtually extinct in Borneo. We still have another subspecies in Sumatra, but we don't think that there is more than 50 to 60 individuals left in the wild. This species is critically endangered. We are not working with rhinos, so I don't want to speak too much about it, but just to highlight the fact that we still have one rhino in Borneo. We have orangutans, of course, but these guys are from Sumatra, and I'm pretty sure that you heard that a few months ago, a new species of orangutan was described. What is really interesting is that if you look at the distribution of the two Sumatran species, they are quite close. But this new Sumatran species, or Tapanulensis, is actually closer in terms of DNA profile, genetic profile, closer to the Bornean orangutan than the Sumatran orangutan, which is really interesting. And it's all because anyway, all these orangutans are critically endangered. The Bornean orangutan was declared critically endangered last year. Why? Because we are losing a lot of populations. We estimate that we have lost maybe over 80% of the original number between 1950 and 2025. This is a projection. Two major reasons: habitat loss and hunting. This is a paper that we produced last year showing where we have the highest, fastest rates of decline of orangutan in Borneo. So you remember we are in Sabah ourselves. So we still lose orangutan in Sabah, but not as fast as in the other parts of the island, which is a good news. And a few days ago, we had a new paper published in Current Biology. Maybe you heard of that because it was all over the news. We showed that in the past 16 years alone, we have lost, let's say, 100,000 orangutans in Borneo. It's a lot. It's a hell of a lot. But two things. It's much faster than what people thought before. So this means that the decline happens very rapidly. But at the same time, it also means that we had more orangutan to start with than people usually believe. Because a lot of time you will see figures about a few tens of thousands of orangutan remaining in the forest. Well, we had much more. If not, they would be extinct already. And this highlights the fact that it's extremely difficult to know how many orangutans are left in the wild, because it's difficult to count them in the wild. But there is a good news, and the good news is that don't believe people or media or articles who say that in 10 years' time or 20 years' time they will be gone. It's not true. Some of the populations we have in Borneo are pretty stable, and they are well protected and well managed. So we have a few populations that are going to, hopefully, that are going to be viable in the long term. So the problem is that we may still lose orangutan because of this. When we look at the range of the species, a lot of them are found outside of protected forest. And of course, when the forest is destroyed, the orangutan disappear. But the paper we just published showed that even in protected forest, or forest exploited for timber, which is about more than half of the current orangutan range, well, we are losing orangutan very fast because of hunting. Actually, hunting is a threat number one for the survival of orangutan. It's not forest conversion, it's not palm oil development, this is hunting. This is why we are losing the species. And this is the message that we showed with the few papers we published over the last 2 years. So this is our team. We are today about 60 people, except for Isabel and myself. All of the people are from the local communities. And as I said earlier, we decided to settle down in Kinabatangan because of that. Kinabatangan used to be a very nice jungle. Pictures taken in 1937 by Martin and Osa Johnson, two adventurers from Kansas. And as you can see, it's a lot of forest. Pristine, virgin, jungle, as far as you can see. This was about 80 years ago. Today, this is a landscape. We still have forest, but it's very fragmented. It's very degraded. And we have a lot of, you know what's that? It's oil palm estates, oil palm landscapes. So this is where we work. This is a map showing you where we are. As far as you can see, most of the time you see palms. But this is where we decided to work. This is where we settled down, because 20 years ago we wanted to know if orangutan is able to adjust, to adapt, to survive in disturbed habitats. Because we have orangutans in Kinabatangan. This is a thing. So I strongly believe in science. Conservation needs science a little bit to support our conclusion. So we design and develop a team that can do the research. This is a team, the orangutan team. 10 people from the village. They are entering the forest every single day, following orangutan, taking notes on orangutan. They are spending their entire life following orangutan, studying orangutan. It's very tough. This is their place of work. This is our study site, 8 kilometers square. So every single day, this team is going there and following wild orangutan. This is Jenny. Actually, not the same Jenny that you saw in the movie earlier. This is a Jenny who was brought by the Brits to London Zoo in 1830. And this is a Jenny who met Sir Charles Darwin. Darwin actually spent a lot of time in London Zoo before going with a beagle everywhere. And in his books, his encounter with Jenny. So sure enough, when we started to habituate the first female at our study site, we called her Jenny, yes. The latest one that you saw earlier in the movie. This is Malotus. Malotus is it's the older sister of Ocean. We have other females like Julina. Julina is also a resident female at our site. We have been following her for 18 years now. Felicity is our oldest offspring, 10 years old. We have males, resident males, flange males like Kusai. Big guys, big flange, beautiful animals. And we have animals like my bro with smaller males, but as you can see in the picture, he's growing his flange, so soon he will be a dominant male as well. We have been able to habituate more than 20 orangutans, and we know about 50 of them. Doesn't mean that we are following them all the time, no. So it's extremely difficult to follow orangutan in the forest. It means that we know about 50 of them, and we regularly follow about 12 to 18 of them every year. And so every year the team processes the data, and we look at, for example, the time budget, and we compare this kind of information with the population that are living in other sites, protected forest, to see if this population in Kinabatangan is able to survive. And indeed, they survive extremely well. They have been able to shift their diet to what kind of resources is available in this forest. We have identified in 8 kilometers square more than 300 species of plants being eaten by orangutan. It's a lot. They spend a lot of time feeding, but also a lot of time resting. So they are up in the canopy, sitting, doing nothing, thinking. We are down below the trees, enjoying the leeches, the mosquitoes, the rain. This is the life of an orangutan researcher in Borneo. It's really frustrating. But these animals are breeding extremely well, as I said earlier. We are following them in the forest, looking at their movements. And this is the kind of thing that after 20 years, we start to be able to understand. In this graph over there, you see the range, the territory of the resident adult females. And as you see, there is a lot of overlap, which is something we would expect. Here, this is the range and territory of their adult offsprings, females. So when their daughters become adults, we still follow them and look at where they go. Actually, they don't go that far. They stay at the same place. So we have more and more and more and more territories of female overlapping. And this is the result of habitat fragmentation because the forest is small. And of course, this is going to create some social stress in the population. So this is the kind of thing we want to better understand in order to better manage this kind of situation. When you work with orangutan, you don't look for orangutan. You look for that. Nest. Why? Because it's extremely difficult, it's extremely rare to see an orangutan in the forest. They are master at hiding. If they don't want you to see them, you won't see them. I tell you. Yesterday we were at the orangutan exhibit, and we have been looking for the male for what, 5 minutes or no? 3 minutes before we found him, because he was hiding in your exhibit. Well, it's just your exhibit, I mean St. Louis exhibit. And it was difficult for me to see the orangutan. Imagine when you are in the forest, you don't even know where they are. So we look for nests. We look for nests from the ground, and this is the way usually scientists estimate population size. But in Sabah, we have also been able to develop a new way, a new methodology to estimate the population size using helicopter. This is a slide I took showing what you see from helicopter. So we can see nest from an helicopter. Of course, we have to fly extremely low, extremely slow, it's extremely dangerous. The pilots, they don't like to do that because if there is the slightest problem, we just crash. But we can know where are the orangutans. We can also follow the population size or status of the orangutan in Kinabatangan, for example. So every 5 years, we do our surveys. And the interesting and sad fact here is that in Kinabatangan, although today this population is protected, although today there is no hunting in Kinabatangan, well, we still have a decline of number. You see, when we started the work, we had 1,100 more or less, and now today it's 785 or 750. We still have a decline, although orangutan breeds well in the forest, although orangutan can find food in the forest. So this was really puzzling for us. We didn't know what was happening until one day we were flying over this landscape of palms, and sometimes in the oil palm plantation you have tiny patches of trees, like here you see, and because we didn't expect to find orangutan in a plantation. So we started to look at what's happening in the plantation, and this is when we realized that actually orangutans are going into the plantations, they are building their nests in the palms, they are eating the leaves, and we have been able, the team has been able to follow orangutan in the plantation, and actually they are starting to shift their diet and to eat the fruits, for example, the fruit of the palms. which is completely new to science. So we have been spending the past 3-4 years to really work at the interface between plantation and forest to better understand this situation. So we have orangutan walking on the ground, not only in plantation, also in the forest. We have orangutan feeding on fruits, on palms, nesting in palms. So actually we have orangutans using oil palm landscapes. It is extremely important for us to know that, because then we can engage with the government, we can engage with the oil palm industry to tell them about this, to try to identify better practices for the industry that will accommodate these new findings. Okay? We have another problem in a place like that. It's what we call habitat fragmentation. In this slide, you see Kinabatangan, the river, and there is this guy, the estate manager, decided that he needed a drain. So he digged a drain. Well, fair enough. The only problem is that an animal, a species like the orangutan, like the gibbon, they cannot swim. You know that. They cannot swim. Swim like stones. Large, heavy stones. They just... So they cannot cross anymore. So all of a sudden, from one night to the next, where you used to have one group of orangutan, all of a sudden, they are completely split. This is what we call population fragmentation as well. So what we did after visiting National Zoo in Washington, D.C., we saw these bridges that the orangutan are using there. So we thought, hey, let's do the same. But of course, I don't know how to build a bridge for orangutan, so what we did was to call to help us some of our zoo partners. And some of them responded the call and came, and so we started to build all kinds of different bridges. And I can tell you that macaques they love bridges, they love our camera trap, and they love to take selfies of them. We have tens of thousands of pictures like this. Macaques, 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 and again, and again, and again. And after a few years, we got that. Orangutans, too, they are using our bridge. But of course, not every day, once in a while, when they need to disperse. But this is enough to alleviate this bottleneck. So this is working very well, and this is a project we did together with our zoo partners. We don't have only orangutan in Kinabatangan, we have these guys. The Bornean elephant, about 1,500 left in Borneo, most of them living in Sabah. These elephants are a bit smaller than the one you have here. They are a bit smaller. They are slimmer. They have relatively large ears and a very long tail. And they are, of course, cute. They are very gentle and very curious. They are elephants. So, for example, I took this picture. I was in a forest, and I was sitting in the middle of this road, logging road, and the elephants were all over. At some point, they knew that somebody was there, something was weird, so they started to call. And all the elephants from this family unit, they came all together around the matriarch to investigate the situation. They were like, something is weird here. So they did a line, and they came closer and closer and closer and closer, and they stopped. Not that far away, they stopped. I was still. And they were like, okay, who is there? Da, da, da. They decided that I was not a real threat. I tried to be very, very small. And they left. And they are so cool that you can really be close to them. I really love these guys. But as the orangutan, you find them more and more in the plantation because the forest is shrinking, because the forest is fragmented. These are data from one of our colleagues, the Danao Gerang Field Center. They are using satellite color, on elephants, and you see the range of various herds. And as you see, the blue and the yellow one are found completely outside of the forest, and we have some elephant herds that spend their entire life now in palm oil plantation, oil palm plantation. So this creates, of course, a lot of problems with the palm oil estates, but also with the villagers. So when we realize that the communities were facing all this human-elephant conflict 20 years ago, we decided to create another unit, which is called the Elephant Conservation Unit. These guys are also from the village, and they have been trained to mitigate conflict. And so they are using noise cannon or electrical fences, patrolling, and all kind of tools to mitigate peacefully this conflict. And as soon as the community sees that we take seriously their concerns and we try to address these problems, these issues, well, the way they look at elephant conservation can change. For the first few years, people in the village didn't understand why we wanted to protect the orangutan or the elephants. But then when we were able to address and mitigate all these conflicts, all of a sudden, they were very happy to share the same landscape, the same habitat than these animals. Thing is that today, we have more and more conflict popping up outside of Kinabatangan because of the forest shrinkage. So our team is now engaging with other communities outside of Kinabatangan where we have similar conflicts to share the experience we have gained over the years and to empower, to train these communities to handle this human-elephant conflict. We do a lot of community mapping, a lot of interview surveys and consultation, a lot of capacity building, and also we produce leaflets and education tools, if you want, for people to better understand what is an elephant and how they can share the same habitat with an elephant. Kinabatangan is a hub for tourism. It's relatively easy to see wildlife, so there is more and more tourists going there, and unfortunately, sometimes tourism can be a pain somewhere. In this picture, the tourists go very close to the elephants, and of course, this is dangerous, and this increases the stress of the animals. So we are working currently with the tourism industry and also with the state government to try to issue guidelines for tourism, responsible tourism. A big issue we are facing over there in Sabah, which is a global issue, is the development of infrastructure, especially roads, because you know when you build a road somewhere, I mean it can cut off a population, it brings a lot of problems together. It's not just the road in itself, it's all what this road is going to bring with it. So 2 years ago, the government of Sabah wanted to create a road and a bridge above Kinabatangan, just where we work in Sukau, which would have been a disaster for elephants. People and elephants. So a lot of groups were against this project. And Malaysia is not the USA or France. In Malaysia, usually when the government says something and wants to do something, they do. There is not much. This is Malaysia. So some people were against, of course. A lot of people were in favor. The good thing of this unfortunate time was that all the NGOs, and we are not so many of us anyway, working in Sabah, we came together and we designed a strategy for Kinabatangan that we were able to present to the government for a better management of the area. And so for months, it was really tense time between opponents and proponents of this project until last year, the government decided to scrap off the project, which was a huge win for us, a huge win for conservation. Because as I said, in Malaysia, this is not happening that often, that the government is listening to to the society. But they realized that this would be a mistake and they stopped it. We were really, really, really happy of that, I can tell you. We have other animals, not only elephants. We have these guys. I think you have them. I haven't seen them because they were... you have Tambada or Bantang here. So we have still a few of them in Borneo. In Sabah alone, maybe 400 animals. But of course, they are threatened and endangered because of hunting. There is still a lot of hunting going on for this species. Another species which is now critically endangered because of hunting is a pangolin. This is the most traded mammal in the world. So hunting is an issue. I was mentioning earlier the problem of hunting an orangutan. It's also a major issue, as I said. So to fight hunting, what KOCP, what we did was to create a team of honorary wildlife wardens, people from the village. They are entrusted with the same right than rangers from the state government, forestry or wildlife department, the equivalent of US Fish and Wildlife Services here in your country. And so they are able to do patrol, to arrest illegal loggers, to do roadblock, to arrest poachers, and they also work a lot with journalists to do some positive and proactive awareness. So we work with newspaper and produce newspaper articles. They also do some water quality monitoring in Kinabatangan because the big problem is we have so much oil palm plantation that there is a lot of silt, a lot of runoff, and especially chemicals, fertilizers, or herbicides who are just washed away when it's raining and everything goes into the river. So we are monitoring this. The idea is to really document the situation and ask for the government and the industry to really improve their practices. We also do some fish survey. And I want to share this picture with you, not because I like dead fish. This is a kind of a catfish, and this is a pollution indicator. This species will be the last species to be gone. We can find it in places in water you cannot believe there is a fish inside. What we didn't know, though, is that this is a female, the one up the upper part of the picture. So we caught her last year, and after 15 minutes, she started to spit stuff. She spat her eggs. This species is a mouth breeder. It's known from some species in the coral reef, sea marine waterfish. It's known from some species of cyclids in Tanzania, in Africa. It's not really known from other kind of freshwater fish in Southeast Asia. So we were really excited to find that. You see the small eggs? She keeps that in her mouth. The funniest part was that a couple of scientists who were there, they were so excited. And the fishermen we were working with were like, what the heck? Of course they keep their eggs in their mouth. They didn't understand why we were so excited. So it's neat. Anyway, I wanted to share that with you. This team is doing a lot of surveys and monitoring. And so frogs, for example, 32 species of frogs have been identified by our teams in Kinabatangan. 2 are still not described. And what we have seen over the years is that the tree frogs that are still common there are actually declining faster than the common sole or the common frog species that are taking over little by little. We do also a lot of work with small mammals. This is a moon rat, family of the tree shrew. These guys are big. They're about 2 pounds, nocturnal tree shrews. They are smelly. You can really smell them from quite far away, but they are cool. So we do this kind of monitoring. This is a tree shrew, an endemic to Borneo. So we are monitoring these small mammals. We catch them and release them. And the same, what we have found out is that the density of small mammals remains more or less constant, but forest-dependent species are declining. And in the contrary, commensal species, invasive species like common rat, house mouse, they are becoming more and more common. they are taking over, if you want. In those places that are highly degraded, we are losing the forest-dwelling species, and we are, on the contrary, having more and more of these commensal species, which is an issue, and this is something else we need to address in the long term. The clouded leopard, the largest cat in Borneo. We don't have tiger in Borneo, not anymore. They used to be there, but they disappeared a few thousand of years ago. In Kinabatangan, we have also sun bear, and altogether 21 or 22 species of carnivora. So we are right now starting a long-term monitoring program that will involve local communities, and they will be the one in charge of implementing this kind of monitoring, which is neat, because usually these kind of programs are done by scientists. In our case, we want the community to do it. So we are working with an NGO called Pantera, based in New York. We are also, of course, working with other primates. This is a gibbon, Bornean gibbon. We have done a lot of surveys of gibbons. Gibbons are relatively easy to survey because every morning they are calling. So you can hear them. Well, the gibbon is not doing well because they cannot really walk. So when they are stuck in a small patch of forest, they are stuck. They just cannot disperse anymore. And I do think that even so in Kinabatangan they are not hunted for food or whatever, they are still disappearing for two reasons. First, they use a lot the electrical wire to move across the landscape, and sometimes they get electrocuted. And second, there is social stress. There is some social stress, and they cannot, I think, cannot breed extremely well. So we have still a real decline of this species. And these guys, you know what is that? Proboscis monkey is a female with a small, tiny nose. Endemic to Borneo, if you want to see them, well, you won't find them in a zoo, except if you go to Singapore. But if you go to Singapore Zoo to see proboscis monkey, well, Singapore is so close to Borneo, better come to Borneo straight. They are really a cute and interesting monkey. We have about 2,000 in Kinabatangan. They are more or less stable, except in areas where the forest is chopped down all the way to the river. In this case, the population drops. So in this case, what can we do? Here in this slide, Malaysia, this is against the law to do that, because in Malaysia, like in the USA, you have to respect, to protect a strip of forest along the river. But of course, a lot of times they don't do that. So in this case, we were able to talk to the government, and the government talked to this estate, and they gave back a strip of land for conservation, which was a neat win for us. It's another project that UTAN is doing. We are actually just acquiring, buying land for conservation. People who want to sell before they sell it to the palm oil industry, okay? And so in this case, we were able to finalize this corridor linking two patches of protected forest, and we are working now on the other side of the river on a new corridor. It's possible, but it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money as well. It's extremely expensive. And a lot of times, this parcel of land are completely bare. They have been completely opened up by people. So if we wait for the natural regeneration to happen, sometimes we can wait a long time and it won't happen because in many cases like that, the land has been compacted by past logging activities and there is no natural regeneration. It's only grass and creepers. So to reconnect the forest, we also created a team, a reforestation team. Here they are, mostly women, because men are completely useless if you want to plant trees back. As they can plant trees, but they cannot really take care of the trees for a long time. And in our case, if we don't maintain our plots, if we don't take care of the seedlings for at least 2 to 3 years, most of them will die. So the team is not only planting seedlings, they are really take care of these seedlings. And this is where women are so much better than men. Sorry, guys. But we have to acknowledge our weaknesses. So we have a team of women who is doing an amazing job because when we think about reforestation, we think, oh yeah, just plant trees, it's fine. Well, it's hard. They have to, it's, okay, Borneo, sometimes it's raining, fair enough, but a lot of time when it's not raining, it's bloody hot. So they are in places where there is no forest because they do reforestation. So they are under the sun. It's very hot, very humid. It's a very tough job to, let's say, open up a site, to clean it up, then to plant the seedlings, and then to maintain the seedlings. Every month, every 2 months, they have to come back and to clean up all the grass, all the creeper, to cut that, because if not, it will just entangle and kill the seedlings. And over the years, our treelets, I mean our young trees are growing. In this picture on the right side, it's one of our planting sites, I think 5 to 6 years after the planting, so you can see the trees are already quite high. Here it's another planting site. When we started, you see the house, and today, the same house. So we are planting mostly what we call pioneer tree species. They are fast-growing species, and we are monitoring our plots. We are planting about 15 or 18 different pioneer tree species. When the trees are already high, the beauty of it is that animals are coming back, hornbills, squirrels, primates, and of course by doing so they are disseminating seeds from other trees. And in our planting sites, we are now identifying trees that we haven't planted. We have identified in one of our sites up to 38 species of trees that we never planted. So this is really cool because this is dynamic and this is happening. It's a second wave of regeneration. Thanks to this team of ladies. Another species we are working with is the helmeted hornbill, critically endangered bird because of the trade. This is the only species of hornbill with a solid casque. So the casque is used and carved, and this is sold as red ivory. If you hear about red ivory, this is it. This is a casque from the helmeted hornbill. This is a bird. It's a big, large hornbill, the largest one in Borneo. It's almost as big as a great hornbill. It's a male. You see very long feathers. And this is a cool picture of the only known natural nest of helmeted hornbill. That happens to be in our study site. And last year, the pair of helmeted hornbills that is living there used this nest and they produced one chick. This is a chick before he flew off. And this is the only known nest for this species so far. So we are definitely looking after this nest and make sure that nobody is going to come and destroy it or kill the birds. What we do for hornbills is also to restore their nest. So we are doing surveys in the forest and sometimes we find cavities that could be used by the birds to breed, but maybe sometimes in this case, the opening was too small. Last year the team fixed 6 of these natural cavities, and in 3 months, 4 of them, I think, 4 of them were used by the pied hornbill. The pied hornbill is a small species. Actually, the pied hornbill is able to breed anywhere almost. So it's not our target species, but it was cool to see that. As soon as we restore the nest, the pied is using it. But we really wanted, and we still want, to support breeding activities of the big species because they don't have enough cavities in Kinabatangan because all the large trees are gone. So this is a video I showed you earlier. We started to build nest boxes, artificial nest boxes. And here again, we are not specialists, so what we did was to ask some of our zoo colleagues to come and help us. A box like that, you have seen it earlier in the video, is about 200 pounds, the weight. So it's not easy to move it in the forest, and then, of course, to set it up in the trees. As soon as we set them up in the tree, all kind of hornbills, the 8 species, will come, and of course other animals, meaning that there is a real interest from the birds for our nest boxes. So sometimes hornbill like this pair of pied, sometimes predators. This is not what we want, but if they come, they are welcome, as long as they don't stay there. And for the longest time, except for the pied hornbill, we didn't have any other species using our hornbill nest boxes. But there was this pair. This is a rhinoceros hornbill, and this pair has been seen around this nest box for more than 2 years. And they never used it. So we were like, never mind, they don't like it, because it's true that it's more humid. So it's drier inside and hotter inside our nest boxes than if this was a natural cavity. We have done a lot of studies here. So we thought maybe the conditions inside the nest box are not proper for these birds. So we have been working at second and third generation prototypes. This is the first generation that we set up 4 years ago. Last year, the same pair used it. And here again, you have to trust me. What you see there in the picture is a beak of the small little guy asking for food from his parents. The mother was already out. And the chick just flew off in September, last September. We were really, really, really excited because it's the first time that rhinoceros hornbill in the wild is using an artificial nest. First time. We're like, yes. So our idea is, of course, to build more of these nests and to set them up everywhere where they are needed. Another project we initiated about 8 years ago is to protect the swiftlet, who are producing nests that are used for the Chinese soup. Okay? The problem is that we have this swiftlet using caves to build their nest, and we realized that there was no management of these colonies, and people would come and take the nest anytime. So actually they would destroy the clutch, they would destroy the chicks, and the colonies of swiftlets were really crashing in the area where we work. So in 2010, we decided to start protecting the caves. That's it. So we have a team of 12 people. Their work is to protect the caves. We prevent anyone to come in to steal the nest. We started in 2010. At this time, we had 317 pairs left in our caves. Today, it's 1,800. More or less. So the idea is to wait and wait and wait and to protect these caves until the colonies of swiftlets are reached a sufficient number when people in the village will be able to start harvesting again commercially. Sorry. But we are not there yet. So far, we are just doing pure protection of these caves. So all this year of work in Borneo and also before in Middle East and Africa taught me one thing. I mean, a lot of things, but one major lesson. When I started this work, I wanted to work with wildlife. This is my interest. And conservation is not about wildlife. Seriously, conservation is just about people. I spend 95% of my time dealing with people, not dealing with wildlife. So when you have accepted that, when you acknowledge this, well, let's work with people. So we have also different projects working with different types of community members, like here, a fisherman. And we are all convinced that it's important to raise awareness, I guess. I guess that we are all convinced. So what we did a few years ago was to create an education team. As I said, our teams are all from the village, so we didn't have any professional educators, and this is a team today. And so here again, we called some of our zoo partners who came to our site and we started to do a lot of training with our educators, and these educators have also been sent overseas, and little by little, they became professional educators. So today, this team of educators is active all over the state in schools and villages, and they are doing regular programs with school children and teachers about wildlife conservation, about better managing their environment, and so forth. Every year, the team is reaching out at least 10,000 to 15,000 kids. This is the target, and this is what they do every year. So it's very efficient. I mean, of course, and it's very, very important and very cool to work with kids. You all know that. So this is what this team is doing. But you see, unlike here in the USA, a lot of time when our team goes, this is in a palm oil estate, you go to the school, it's not a group of 15 kids that you have to deal with. It's 200 or 300. So the way to reach out is a bit different, and it has to be adjusted. Our project, we also do at our project a lot of research, academic research, not because we are an academic institution, but also because I think that conservation decisions need to be based on strong and solid science. So we do a lot of publication and scientific communication. I'm working with a bunch of scientists under the Borneo Future project, and we have produced a lot of science to try to inform better the government of Indonesia and Malaysia about deforestation, about the possible choices they could have to develop their countries and so forth. So it takes a lot of my time. I'm working in Sabah a lot with the government to improve or to develop new policies or improve existing ones, like orangutan action plan, like forest management plan, and so forth. It's a way for us to use all the knowledge we gain in the field and influence policymakers and land use deciders, politicians. I think it's really important for us to do that. And we, of course, work a lot with local newspapers to raise local awareness. A result of all these efforts is this. When we started, so this is Sabah, when we started in 2000, only 12% of Sabah was fully protected, and today 28, actually, not 26, but 28% of the landmass is fully protected. 28% is a lot. It's much more than what we have in the USA or France. So they have really done a lot of, they are trying to improve the situation. So all the colors here are protected forests. So right now we are working with the government to try to reconnect this protected forest. Actually, the government wants to protect 30% of the state by 2020, so next year, 2 years from now. So it's really something that is happening in Sabah right now. What does that mean for orangutan? Well, when we started, no one really knew where were the animals and how many did we have. So as I said earlier, we used helicopter to survey orangutan. We were able to identify the major orangutan population. And in the early 2000s, we had 11,000 animals in the state of Sabah. 11,000, it's a significant number. And as I said at the very beginning of my talk, it's extremely difficult to count orangutans. Yes, it's true, but in Sabah, because Sabah is not that big, we are actually pretty precise with our estimates. We have about, let's say, 10,000 orangutans in these big populations. And we have, of course, a lot of other groups that are not counted here, the small groups of orangutan that are the ones, unfortunately, that disappear. So 20 years ago, 75% of the orangutan in Sabah were living outside of protected forests. The government is creating more and more protected areas. Today, most of the orangutan population in Sabah are living inside protected forests. And this is why I told you at the beginning, there is still hope. This population in Sabah are protected. They are not going to go away anytime soon, as far as I know. So this is the good news. Last but not least, we are also working globally. So Bhutan, our project, is very much involved with the RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. We do believe in certification. We don't believe in boycott. I don't think boycott is going to help us at all. What is going to help us is to engage with the industry, engage with the politicians to try to improve the situation and the practices. So we spend a lot of time with the certification process, RSPO. The state government of Sabah 2 years ago decided that the entire production of palm oil from Sabah, which is 10% of the global output, should be certified by 2025. This has never been done before, so it's something we are all on board with the government. We try to make this happen. I'm not sure if we will be successful, but we are trying hard, because if this is a success, this means that the practices in Sabah will be much better than what they are today. So this is a way to protect also forests, to protect biodiversity and orangutan. Working with the IUCN, which has a palm oil task force. This afternoon I was really glad to meet the St. Louis Zoo palm oil task force. I mean, it's really interesting to see that more and more people are speaking about these issues, and I think that we are at the forefront, in the front line of palm oil development when we are working in Borneo. It's important for us, I think, to feed all these groups with the information that comes from the field. So I'm part of the IUCN Palm Oil Task Force, part of the UN, GRASP, UNDP, the United Nations groups dealing with great apes, and we try to inform all these organizations about what's going on there. Not to criticize, but to try to find solutions. And last year we created Pongo Alliance. We is a consortium of scientists, NGOs, and growers, palm oil growers. We try to sit together on the same table and design new landscapes, new ways to produce this crop that will allow for animals like orangutan or elephants to also survive. It's not easy, but I think it's possible. So, to wrap up, all of this is possible to do, but we need at least two things. First, intense capacity building. We are working with people from the village. Most of them, they don't have any higher education. They stopped school. They were in their 14s or 15 years old, teens, young teens. Well, if you give them a chance and if you spend a lot of time with them, these guys, our teams are just amazing. They are the ones today who do the research, collect the data, process the data, analyze the data, write reports and stuff like that. They are the ones to go sometimes overseas and give lectures as well. They are the ones to become trainers. We do a lot of training and capacity building at Bhutan for people from the government, other NGOs, people from overseas, people from the industry. And most of the time, I'm not even there. The team is organizing everything, and they are the trainers. And this is great to achieve that, because people are really becoming not only the guardian, as we hear all the time, of their resources, but the managers. And this is much more important. And this is what Isabelle and I, since the very beginning, we were interested in. We really wanted to work with communities to make sure that these people who are at the front line of conservation are engaged and are involved in the management of their resources. And this is possible, but you need time. And this is where a partnership with zoos like St. Louis is very important, because zoos, they can support in situ projects in the long run. And as you can see, we are working with many zoo partners. These ones are just the ones helping us this year, and there are zoos from the USA, zoos from Europe and Australia as well. And I think that the partnership with zoos is really beneficial for everyone. And last but not least, and this is what we have discussed over the past 2 days since I have been here, what for me is very important when I engage with a zoo like St. Louis is that you people, you are able to reach out a public that I will never reach out, your visitors. And this is important, because only then, by touching and raising awareness with the visitors, we can make a difference. And before I just stop, I wanted to say something about how the palm oil industry is looking at you guys, the zoo community. Let me tell you that they are really afraid of you. They are very afraid of what a zoo can tell to the public. They are really concerned about the image they have and what you could say about them. So it's something that is important to consider, because this means that all the message you can give to your public here can make a difference. Thank you very much. Oh my God, I have spoken too long. Sorry for that. Any question? Anyway, it's still raining, so we are better here inside, isn't it? I would be glad to answer any question you may have. Yeah. So the question is there any tiger in Borneo? No, unfortunately. We had tiger at some point, but they never really settled down. So we don't really know why. We think it's because there is not enough prey. So they reached Borneo, but they never stayed. We had tapir. You know tapir? So tapir is gone from Borneo, but the last one went extinct a few hundred years ago only, so it's very recent. So, but yeah, no. They never, tiger, no. So issues between people interacting with zoonotic disease, sorry. Well, it's a good question. The thing is, we are following orangutan and other species entering these new landscapes, and definitely their behavior is different. And of course, the animals, orangutans, are now walking on the ground, so potentially they can meet people, they can meet cattle and this kind of other domestic animals that spread diseases. So there is definitely a risk of disease transmission. We still don't have any data. When I say we, there is not many people working on these issues. There is a project from EcoHealth Alliance, and they are kind of looking at these new emerging diseases in these new landscapes, but there is a dearth of data right now on this particular issue. It's definitely one new threat. Yes? So the question is about the economic incomes of all these communities. So it really depends where you are. So in Sabah, which is Malaysia, and it's kind of wealthy country compared to Indonesia, a lot of people, rely on palm oil. A lot of villagers have a small piece of land and it's covered with palms and they make some money out of that. Where we work in Kinabatangan, a lot of people are involved in the industry, the tourism industry. And of course, a lot of them are working with us, but it's different. In Kalimantan, it's much more, how do you call that? It's agriculture, but not palms, it's like more, sorry, tired. Borneo is primarily agriculture-based economy. Yes? This I cannot hear, I'm sorry. Okay. Is a question about killing orangutan, why they do that? So, a lot of the hunting happens for two major reasons. Sometimes it's because of conflicts. So conflicts, people are afraid of the orangutan, or the orangutan are destroying their crops, so people just shoot them. But the other reason is because people are hunting them for food. But there is a caveat here. They don't go to the forest to hunt orangutan. They go to the forest to hunt wild boar, to hunt deer, and they will spend 1 day or 2 days in the forest, and sometimes they don't get anything, and let's say on their way back to the village, if they find a gibbon, if they find an orangutan, they will shoot and eat. So they are not hunting orangutan every single day. It's just once every year, every few years at the village level. So it's very seldom. But orangutan is such a slow breeder that this is enough to just bring the population to extinction. So this is really interesting because a lot of groups are against this kind of findings that we have been highlighting recently, our group of researchers, when we say hunting is really a big problem. A lot of people say, no, it's not true. Hunting is not the problem. The problem is palm oil. And we say, no, hunting is really the #1 issue for orangutan. And they say, yeah, well, people, sometimes they do kill orangutan. It's so rare. Well, this is a point. Orangutan is a slow breeder. If you remove one female, more than 1% of the female from a population, the population go extinct in less than 100 years. So this is the thing, even if there is a very slow intake from poaching, this is enough to get your population extinct. So it's one of the issues we try to highlight. Of course, here in the USA, you cannot do much about orangutan hunting. What we can do here is to improve land use practices, oil palm development practices, because oil palm development remains a threat, of course. But I really would like you to understand that this is not the only threat. All these groups that claim that orangutan is disappearing because of palm oil, this is wrong. It's not only palm oil. Palm oil is one part of the equation. But we need to, the good thing with palm oil is that there are ways to tackle that. It's much more difficult to stop hunting from happening. Are you happy to go back to the rain? Any other question? Okay.